Charles Strauss on the Planning Commission, Sarah Kipp, Planning Commission, Nick Redmond, Planning Commission, and Jenny Dumont, Planning Commission. Also, Chad Claybaugh, our Borough Engineer, and John Whitmore, our Planning Director. We are absent John Rice today, so Jenny, who is our alternate, will be fully participating in this meeting, both in discussion and if we take any votes. So I wanted to, again, begin with just a few comments before we approve our agenda. And that is a reminder of what we're doing tonight, which is continuing to discuss our rezoning effort here in the borough. The Pennsylvania Municipal Code designates the Planning Commission as the place where redrafting of the borough's zoning ordinance begins. The borough initiated this process over a year ago through an ad hoc committee organized by the Borough Council and Manager, in which 2 members of the Planning Commission served. This past May, the Planning Commission saw the proposed new ordinance for the first time, and we have focused nearly our entire time on this subject at the June, July, August, September meetings, as we will also do this evening. Each of these meetings have been filmed and broadcast thanks to the generosity of residents who have paid community media for this service. Right now, right as we speak, the Gettysburg Borough Council is putting together their 2025 budget, and I personally encourage you to reach out to your council member and ask if they could increase their budget line item for community media so that the Planning Commission meetings continue to be filmed, but paid for out of our tax revenue and not private donations. Remember, the Gettysburg Planning Commission is unique in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Unlike in most municipalities, in Gettysburg, the Planning Commission has final decision-making authority over subdivision and land development plans, as opposed to Borough Council, which is how it is done in most other places. As many of you know, there is likely to be a significant land development plan coming to the Planning Commission soon, and it would be nice to have those meetings filmed. But back to the zoning ordinance, redrafting. It is the Borough Council who will ultimately make the decision on the ordinance revision through a vote at a business meeting, but only after the Planning Commission makes our recommendation. At our last meeting in September, the group present entertained the idea of making this recommendation at the December 2024 meeting. But it will be our decision tonight and perhaps next month whether we are able to do that by that deadline. Please remember, Planning Commission members, that this is our document at the moment, and we should be certain that we have done all the work necessary to make a recommendation that we can stand behind and support. As tough as that is when there are competing goods, differing opinions, and many details. So let's get back to work on this by reviewing and approving the agenda. As you can see, we will review and approve the minutes from the September 16th meeting. We will then have our first public comment period. Now, tonight, given the number of people present, and also given how much back and forth we have had between commission members, the public, our planning director and solicitor, and at last month's meeting, the consultant Troy Truax, during recent meetings, we will limit the public comment period to 3 places in the meeting. At the beginning, in a few minutes, at the end, but also in between item 2, supplemental regulations, and item 3, review of prior meetings district standards. And that's because we have already discussed item 3, and item 4 won't have a whole lot of discussion, I don't think. But this is the first time that the public has been able to discuss items 1 and 2. So I've inserted a public comment in between 2 and 3 so that you could respond to any of the discussion that we will have up here on items 1 and 2 on your agenda. So again, we will have 3 public comment periods. We have no tabled old business. We will then move through the 4 items related to rezoning. And I understand that the solicitor and planning director have some things to share based upon their research since the last meeting when we asked them to do a little research for us on some items before we move to announcements and the final public comment period. Is there a motion to approve tonight's agenda?
I'll move to approve the agenda.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
So Marty moved and Nick seconded. Any discussion on our agenda? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
I vote aye, and that motion passes 5-0. Are there any corrections to the September 16th meeting minutes? Is there a motion to approve those minutes?
I'll move to approve the meeting minutes of September 16.
And a second?
I second.
Marty moved and Jenny seconded. I understand that you two want to abstain from approving the minutes?
No, I was present and
Okay.
but I was not full capacity for understanding all the conversation, so
There were some AV
I
issues.
will vote, but I didn't want to make a second.
Okay, so all those in favor of approving those minutes, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions?
I'm abstaining because I was not here.
Okay, so that motion passes 4-0 with one abstention from Nick Redmond. Okay, so we have new business. Let's begin with the R2, Moderate Density Residential District. This residential district has been discussed, but not fully. So far in the process, we've discussed R1 quite extensively. We will return to that in item 3. But Nick, or I mean, I'm sorry, John or Adam or Chad, would you like to begin things with the R2?
Yeah, I have numerous maps up. I have to apologize right off the bat. I provided you all with incorrect information regarding an analysis for the down zoning of parcels. I was using the map that we have on our website with the slide bar. It has not been properly updated and does not reflect the most recent map amendments. So as such, parcels.
Yeah, could you speak into the microphone, John? Thanks. Oh, gosh. Before you begin, that is my fault. Thank you, Chuck Stanger, for reminding us that before we do the first item of new business, we have public comment to any items on the agenda, noting that you will have 2 more opportunities. But to begin, please come to the microphone and state your name and address. Thank you.
Hi, Shelley Nouse, 28 Chambersburg Street. I just want to say thank you to the Planning Commission for taking the time to do this in the way that you've been doing it, and also to John Whitmoyer, our new planner, because I know it's not his draft document. He came into this, and I noticed, I won't be here the next meeting, but in the end of this year, 2 of the members of the Planning Commission are up for approval. So I would really hope that we'd have that continuity, considering this is a document that Mr. Whitmoyer wasn't here for, and then also so there's just continuity going into next year for all of you that have been part of this every way along the process. And thank you for taking your time with it.
Hi, I'm Chuck Stangor. I live at 275 Ridge Avenue. I also am the publisher of Gettysburg Connection. I think I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record here, but I want to second Shelley's comments about the amazing work of this commission. Over the past few months, you've been a model of government transparency. The many meetings discussing this big rezoning project have been well attended. The meetings have been well organized, topics have been discussed fully, and thanks to some citizen contributions that you pointed out, Charles, videotapes of the meeting have been shared online. You've also held open houses both here and at the farmers market, and you've moved the venue here to the rec park where more people can attend to improve accessibility. As a result of this work, there's been a lot of interest from the public. You've taken their comments seriously, you've provided honest answers to the questions, and you've modified the zoning document when necessary. Although it rarely does, in my opinion, government should work exactly how you're doing it. Your work is engaging the community, it's giving people agency over the decision-making process. I think this is making your document better and will also make your job of selling it to the public much easier, because so many people have already contributed to it. So thank you, Charles, for steering the ship. Thank you to the committee for your work on keeping this ship moving forward. I know it's a difficult one. And thank you, John, for your guidance. I am so happy that you are here in Gettysburg. You are the very model of a modern planning commissioner. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck. Thank you. Any other public comment at this time? You can, Sue, yes. Talk about anything on the agenda. Sir, you can go.
My name is Don Schmitz, and I'm representing Foursquare Church, 328 West Middle Street. The block containing the Foursquare Church property is currently included in the proposed zoning map as R2 residential. We believe this is not the correct classification. We believe the church property should be included in the Gettysburg Plaza Kenny's commercial block as a GC commercial property. When the planning department began working on proposed changes to the zoning code, the staff designated certain properties in the borough's southwest quadrant, including the church property, Rite Aid, and High Street Brews as T4-1 auto-oriented neighborhoods. The map showing the planning department's original proposal was included with the agenda for the Planning Commission meeting on July 17, 2023. At that meeting, the Planning Commission discussed the map and indicated that it would accept the proposed exclusion of the church property from the residential district. The minutes indicated that the Planning Commission commented that Middle Street from west of Foursquare Church to the end should be considered high-density residential, marked as Area 12 on the revised map that was included with the minutes of the meeting. However, in the May 15, 2024 version of the zoning map that was presented to the Planning Commission at its May 2024 meeting, the proposed classification of the church property was changed to residential. The minutes do not indicate whether that change was discussed at the meeting or why it was made. Rite Aid and High Street Brews were left as commercial properties. Without knowing why that change was made or what distinguishes Rite Aid and High Street Brews from the church property, it is difficult to provide specific comments. However, we do believe the Planning Commission was correct in its original view that the church should not be included in the West Middle Street residential district. The church property is contiguous with the Kenny's Gettysburg Plaza commercial block. In terms of location and use, the church has much more in common with Kenny's than it does with the residences on Middle Street. Although the church doesn't sell its products and services, its size, scope of operations, parking, number of people served, and frequency and manner of use are more similar to a business than any other zoning classification. The church, Kenny's, Rite Aid, and High Street Brews all share the same characteristics of a large facility, frequent access, temporary use, large number of people, auto-oriented with parking, non-residential, and street frontage with pedestrian access. It is prejudicial to deny the church similar commercial classification as the other three properties because it is a church. The church property isn't residential now and is no more suitable for future residential use than Kenny's, Rite Aid, or High Street Brews. In terms of use and function, the church has the essential characteristics of a commercial property. It's important because the church may one day outgrow its current building. More than 700 people come every Sunday, and last week we had over 800 people come throughout the week for various events. There are a few days when the church is not in use. Should the church ever need to sell its property, it will have to recoup its investment. But if it's not able to be sold for commercial use, that may not be possible. Accordingly, we respectfully request that the Planning Commission change the designation for the block containing Foursquare Church to GC General Commercial. Thank you.
Thank you. John, can we talk about this either in item 1 or item 3?
Yes.
So whichever you think is better.
Number 1.
Separately, did you want to?
I've given you a handout that has comments about R2, but it also, if you get to the revitalization zone, that's the second page. I gave you some detailed analysis at the last meeting about the difference between the existing R2 and the proposed. And some of the things that have been added into the R2 just don't fit. One thing that was done was added bed and breakfast back in, which the council just deleted from R2 and other zones in October of 2021. And that took 2 years, not 2 hours, to devise. Some other uses that are added in are fraternities and sororities, which are party houses, and who would buy a house next to one? Why should a neighborhood have to put up with it? It added dwelling, student housing, institutional. The college owns it, but no matter how much supervision there is, it doesn't happen. It also competes with other people looking for housing to rent or to own in R2. Community residence / group home, sober living facility / recovery house, both need a larger structure and more residents than are allowed than permitted in R2. Motel was added in. Really? Remember that R2 zoning exists in several areas of town, so these uses could be in any of those neighborhoods. And then the next page is about revitalization, and I have a suggestion that the area to the west of Carlisle Street be left as Old Town, except for the part that's north of the Tiber, that's residential. There's no reason to change the area west of Carlisle to revitalization. And the extended height incentives, one of them in the revitalization, one of the criteria was vegetated surfaces, including vegetated stormwater management facilities. And stormwater management facilities are not meant to be for public access. And then the Gettysburg Inner Loop offered an incentive for height if you built part of the Gettysburg Inner Loop Trail on a different property in one of the NC zones. I don't understand how that would work. And very little of the Inner Loop Trail is in those zones anyway. So, thank you.
Thank you. We will revisit these when we do R2, because we did take on the bed and breakfast topic at the last meeting, I believe.
Yes.
So thank you for addressing that, and we'll remind the group of what the consensus was, and then we'll take the other ones when we get to R2. Are there other comments at this time?
Good evening, and I want to, before I begin, echo the thanks that other people have given to this group for your hard work. It is much appreciated, and I know you won't get swelled heads over it, but it's really, truly earned, so thank you.
My wife, your name and address.
Excuse me?
Name and address.
Oh, Mike Malowicki. My wife Mary and I live at 2 West Broadway. This won't come as a surprise what the topic is, but Mary and I are here tonight advocating for future rentals in an R1 district to be limited to 2 unrelated individuals. It's a canard that advocating for two unrelated people renting in an R1 zone is based on some sort of homophobic agenda. That notion is both absurd and insulting. The definition of a family needs to change with the times, reflecting the reality of today's world, while at the same time preventing financially motivated absentee lords from renting to students who are often clueless about how to live and behave in a residential neighborhood. This is not an easy needle to thread, so everybody has their work cut out for them. So, thank you.
Thank you. And we will revisit that on item number 3 when we return to some things that we have to return to from last month.
Hey, Bob Kermerick. I'm with my wife Kim, 125 West Broadway. Wanted to echo what you've heard earlier about limiting to 2 the number of unrelated people in the R1 district. And just reminder, something I know Mr. Strauss and John Bryce know well, is how many organizations such as this and council and the work that you do that goes unrewarded so often are built by people who are living on those streets in the R1 district. And the more of those homes you turn into unregulated frat houses or some sort of retirement homes, it's going to make it more and more difficult to find people to do the kind of work you're doing now, because those people aren't going to come down here and volunteer for zoning or council. And I ask, as my other neighbors have, that you keep that number to 2. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Other comments? Okay, then we'll pause public comment until after item number 2 on the agenda. So now let's return to John Whitmore, and could you introduce R2? I think you were sharing something related to the analysis you provided us.
So I had incorrectly, in completing this change in land use parcel analysis, I incorrectly used the map that we still have on our website, which I'll be taking down after this meeting. Specifically, parcels, the Rite Aid parcel High Street Brews were identified as being different zoning districts than they have been identified in the May zoning map draft, word salad. But to get to the bulk of the analysis, excluding those 2 parcels, overwhelming majority, there's only, so 44 South Franklin, that parcel is being zoned from Old Town to R2 in the map. It currently has a medical office and broadcast studios. So that one would be a non-conforming situation for the medical office component. The broadcast studios operating as an office would be permitted in the R2 as a special exception. 321 Carlisle Street. This is a property that is currently in the RO district. It's going to be changed to R2. It's a funeral home. That is also not permitted in the R2 district. So in looking at those, overwhelming majority of these parcels are really being used as the district that is being requested by planning staff. There are going to be instances where we have these lodging uses, such as 196 South Stratton. It's an inn. It's also vacation rental. That's one of the challenges is when it comes to the R2 district. What level of short-term rental are we, as the borough, going to allow? Tourism has a way of impacting the built environment. You have individuals utilizing properties in a different manner. You have congestion that occurs differently. Access to the property and vehicle trips are going to be different as compared to a residential use. So something to keep in mind when we went into this. I'll reiterate what we talked about last month and the months prior. The idea was to enable increased access to housing opportunities in the borough. So to a certain extent, these inns and vacation rentals have been deprioritized as compared to a residential use, which could be utilized in many instances. It's not to say it's going to be the use that the property owner necessarily wants, but that's when we get into zoning and the police power of the borough to affect the land use and real property surroundings in the borough. So a lot to say right then and there. Overall, the R2 district is kind of a misnomer. You already have with the R1 district the ability to do duplexes, so you can have a moderate density already by default. The R2 is where you can have your higher densities, in particular multifamilies, and some of the more concentrated student housing uses. When you look at the built environment of the borough, there's a clear distinction when it comes to an R2 style zoned property. The houses tend to be smaller. You see larger example, more clusters of duplexes, more clusters of multifamilies. The houses themselves, in accordance with the current development standards that we've provided the imaging for. Pull that up. Oh, where is it? The R2 properties, you're not going to get a sense of traditional suburbia. It's going to have more of the feel of an urban built environment. As you can see, we're talking about situations where the buildings are able to have a 10-foot build-to line, but then also having just a minimum separation of 5 feet. Otherwise, you have 0-foot setback from the sides. Well, 5 foot from the side, 0 if it's an attached dwelling. This is the zoning district where you're going to see more incidents of townhomes, the apartment buildings. That's why I said it's kind of a misnomer to call it moderate density, but this is a port from the current ordinance. Looking at the map, the real changes to the R2 district are occurring in relationship to Elm Street overlay. Some of these properties that, I guess they're currently in the Old Town area that are going to also become R2. Now I'm looking at these properties in particular, they're overwhelmingly utilized as residential, especially these properties that near the elementary school and the municipal building. These are all designed as single-family homes. I think there's one duplex building in this block, which that's pretty unusual. If you go even one block around this area, that's when you're seeing a real mix of housing types, and really that's what the R2 district is supposed to be providing, your whole mix. Other than that, I mean, we can discuss some of the specific points that were brought up.
I have an idea here. If we could have a discussion with you involved on uses, and I think to bring the solicitor in related to the use sober living.
Yes.
And then have a discussion on building standards, which I don't think is going to be as extensive as the uses. And then look at the map, particularly related to this question that just came up about Foursquare Church. Does that sound okay? If we do uses, then standards, then map on R2. Okay, let's start with uses. And the first one Ms. Sibberly brings up, well, the first one on our chart, and if all of you have this ordinance in front of you, the R2 district starts on page 31. The map, or the chart, though, that lists all the uses is on page 61. And the first set of uses has to do with principal uses residential. And the very first two on that list are community residence group home and community residence sober living facility recovery house. And I think we have some research to report from the solicitor on this.
I don't want to go into too much detail on this. To state what you might have already known, when we took a look at this, there's nothing that I'm aware of in the text of the Fair Housing Act, which was kind of the impetus for the discussion last month, that says that you have to have specific land uses in specific zones. And that probably doesn't come as a huge surprise that Congress didn't get into the nitty-gritty on that. With that said, prohibitions on certain land uses can have an impact or result in something that is discriminatory and therefore prohibited under the Fair Housing Act. So it's not a question of, you know, does the act itself do this? It's what is the effect of the zoning ordinance, and is that effect such that you then have a legal issue? I am not aware of anything that says that a group home and a sober living facility have to be, and on that draft they're not, lumped in together. I mean, those are not functionally latched together, that they have to be in the same districts or they have to be treated as the same land use. I think there's a lot of overlap between them, particularly depending on how that definition is written, distinguishing between them. But to the best of my knowledge, you can separate them into two uses as you have done, and you can have them in different zones should you wish to do that. Ultimately, the question is how far do you want to go to make sure that you're not running afoul of unlawful discrimination under the Fair Housing Act. But there's not a black and white answer as to where it has to go or how far you've gone before creating an issue. We live in the world of the gray.
Do you want to say another sentence, though, about, though we don't have to decide this by housing and districts, but it would be probably not a good idea to discriminate people? I think that was further what you were...
Good call, yeah. Yeah, I mean, the goal is, I mean, when you're looking at this sort of issue is, it's not discriminating against the land use, it's discriminating against people who stand to live, in this case, because it's a residential use. You're discriminating against people by virtue of effectively where they have to live. I mean, if you're living in a sober living facility, the discrimination is against the person, not against the property.
Okay. So let's have discussion, as this has been raised as a concern. Just point out on the chart here that in the R2, currently the committee has proposed, not us, the committee that drafted this has proposed community residence group home by right in R2 and the sober living by special exception. Is there any discussion on whether this warrants, there should be a change to this proposed designation?
And to be clear, I think what you have right now is fine. I mean, if you want to change it, we can talk about that, but that's up to you.
I'll note, the comment that Ms. Sipperly shared with us is that both need a larger structure and more residents allowed than permitted in R2. So, John, can you interpret that? I think she's suggesting that it would not actually be possible given how large these places are? Or do you have any reaction to that?
I mean, the R2 district, you can do a multifamily structure, so you can do larger buildings. When staff initially brought this concern up by the suggestion of combining them, we wanted to make sure that we weren't creating a situation where these uses have to be combined. So that's my reaction. If we're okay with as it is, staff is okay with proceeding. The use of special exception would allow for specific conditions if there are unique situations that you want to control for. So like making sure the structure is large enough to handle the number of occupants. That could be something that would be added. That would not be, we could look to other communities to look for draft language to that effect, but otherwise it's going to be international building code that comes into play with how many people could physically be living in the structure. Sober living facilities do tend to have multiple individuals per bedroom. The Oxford House model specifically seeks to have these houses in residential neighborhoods to assist with recovery. So that's something to keep in mind. It's not unusual for communities to be concerned about these uses. It does change the structure, but at the same time, assuming the other regulations, the other community components, making sure that the individuals are actually in treatment, making sure that the individuals are living there, that can be, the individual providers can be more problematic than the whole class of use.
And the regulations here would prevent a group trying to disguise themselves as a group home or sober living facility just to be able to have more people living in it.
That would
be certain regulations that you would have to qualify for in order to have this use, correct?
Yeah, it's correct. You can't just claim a land use and it has to be functional. Yeah, there has to be documentation and real use of the property in accordance with the ordinance.
Any thoughts from the commission?
I feel almost like we're getting into discrimination that doesn't cross the line of being illegal, but it still is a form of discrimination, and I wonder if that collectively as a group is where we want to go with this. You know, I have concerns with
In
this.
the current language?
Yeah, the way it is, and also with, you know, the relation of where we can have families and stuff, which we'll be discussing. I think we're discriminatory in intent, even if it's not illegal, and I have problems with that.
So just so I understand, what would you like to change about the way that it is now?
I would like to see community residences in all areas. As a matter of practice, whether or not they go into R1 or R2, they may not for practical reasons, but I think that the intent should be to allow them in all areas of the borough.
Okay. So currently, the community residences are permitted in all the residential, and the sober living are provided by special exception in the R2. So I think what you're saying is to add that to the R1, and then the other districts. But can we hold on that until we get to the R1? Until we get to the R1? Wait, hold on. If we're not making any decisions, and we'll have time in a minute for that. Yeah, we'll have time for a second. So when we get to the third item, when we go back to do R1, then we can talk about adding that if that's your suggestion, and then we'll have input. Because the R2 is what we're talking about now, and it's currently provided for in the R2.
By special exception.
I see. Okay, you want to change it from special exception to R. That's your specific. Okay. So any thoughts about that? The idea to make sober living facility not by special exception, but by right in the R2 that Jenny raises.
John, could you maybe describe some of the terms that a use like this would have to meet in a special exception?
Pull that.
John, did you hear me? Great. Speaking to the mic.
John, you're a little hard to hear right now for me.
Okay, so, yeah. Residential facility used by 4 or more individuals residing together voluntarily or by court requirement to recover from drug, alcohol, and/or substance abuse, and that does not include current illegal use of or addition to a controlled substance. So, by default, if you're claiming to be a sober living facility, the individuals have to be in active recovery. Generally, it's a little easier. There's going to be state certification or national certification for many of them. But there are more small business providers, more local treatment options that there may not be that. So we'd be then going further to ensure that, A, how the structure is going to be used, working with them through our code enforcement officer, and then make sure, like, okay, if this is a program, how is this really happening? So just trying to get some kind of documentation for our files that we could then present, if needed, to the zoning hearing board for a, if we get to a point where we would be looking at either a special exception or some sort of review of the current, it'd be an administrative appeal, I believe. So if there would be challenge to any citation that we would issue in the event that that staff were to find that the use is not a sober living facility. Sometimes, in terms of special exception conditions, you can have limitations or requirements on a certain number of parking. the ability for staff to be present at certain times. It can go even further, looking at specific agreement by the property neighbors. There's lots of things you can do. I mean, it is a challenging land use. It's an odd one, though, because there is a benefit to having a sober living facility as a neighbor. You're guaranteed, if it is a legitimate sober living facility, you're guaranteed how your neighbors are going to be behaving as compared to, say, a student rental or something where it's going to be more disruptive to the neighborhood. So in case studies, I mean, it really is going to be provider by provider. They're the ones that are going to be more problematic as opposed to just the class of use.
So just in this case, just to remind us and the audience, but for this particular kind of use, the terms they would have to meet, being a special exception, would be provided in the zoning ordinance or created at the time of the application?
Yes. Well, and or during the actual hearing itself with the board.
So there wouldn't be set criteria in advance they have to meet. There could be additional criteria required during your application process?
There could be. Generally, that's going to be more on a proffer basis from the applicant, so they're going to suggest certain limitations to make their special exception application more appealing to the board. If that makes sense, they want it to be approved. If they're aware they might have certain problems, they can remedy them with making conditions for the zoning hearing board to place into the use of the property.
And when there is a special exception request from an applicant, that means there's a period of public, the public can come to meetings of the Planning Commission and attend.
So that there's certain classes of individuals that would have specific ability to question and actually be more engaged in the process than the general public. Any parties that are aggrieved by the actions could then take issue to court, in which case there's I believe it's a 30-day review period after the decision from the zoning hearing board, so that there's opportunities for an appeal even from that decision. It's not a public process, though. It's a quasi-judicial process. It takes place of a lower level, magistrate level court, and it operates with evidence. I mean, it's very similar to a traditional court case.
There's one more question. As an example, I'm trying to think of anything in the borough that would be like what is proposed here. Is the Mercy House would be defined as one of these houses? And is that in use currently?
So that one, it really depends on how it functions. Generally, that might even be a governmental facility, just depending on the ownership and how it's arranged. I would have to go back to our property files to establish how the current land use has been determined, but I believe we utilize the group home, but it's coming from memory, not without looking at the file. I can't provide exactly on that.
And do you know, have we received any complaints from nearby residents of the Mercy House by activities or that have happened there?
We didn't receive complaints. We've just had our standard inspections process. They've gone through, I believe I'm speaking to the same property. They've recently gone through a change of ownership, if I'm correct. So that's been staff's involvement, at least zoning. Now, when it comes to police issues and things like that, I haven't been made aware or privy to anything that would be negative that would make us really want to warrant a review of the land use, say from the police chief or the borough manager. Sorry.
Just to add a little bit of additional color to what John was saying about special exceptions. Sometimes zoning ordinances will say, for this special exception, you have to meet certain criteria, setbacks, buffers, what have you. Other times they don't, but at the special exception hearing, when those are held, essentially they're advertised to the public via the newspaper. Depending on how the ordinance is written, adjoining property owners will get notice, the property's posted. So it's not It's not something that happens at a meeting without the people who are likely to care the most knowing about it. At that hearing, anybody who essentially proves that they, as John said, can be aggrieved or has standing or a right to be interested in it, essentially, within the discretion of the board, can have the opportunity to weigh in on it. And then ultimately, provided that all the criteria in the zoning ordinance are met and it's determined that it's not going to be detrimental to health, safety, welfare of the community, the board has to approve it. But they can place conditions on it, reasonable conditions, with the goal being to safeguard the public health, safety, and welfare, but you can't load it up with such stuff that it's therefore impossible to do. You can't say, well, you have to have 100-foot redwoods planted in the first day. That's not going to work. So a special exception hearing is the opportunity, or an opportunity, for the public and the people who care the most to weigh in on it. But effectively, the policy decision's been made via the zoning ordinance that this should be permitted generally within this area.
Okay. To move this along, I want to do two things. First, what we should have done at first, as soon as we started talking about R2, is remind everyone what the purpose of R2 is according to this proposed ordinance. And this is on page 31, that the purpose of the moderate density residential district, or R2, is to provide for the development of certain areas of the borough into residential neighborhoods that contain a mix of attached two-family and detached residential dwellings and create a walkable access to goods and services in the downtown and other destination areas within the borough. And then the second thing is just make my opinion on this known. I support the way that the draft is written currently, with the understanding that special exception is not meant to prevent a use in any way or to do anything discriminatory, but allows the neighborhood and the local officials to set certain parameters in which that use can be accomplished. And so I take personally the recommendations of the committee on these 2 points as my opinion. But we have now at least 2 different opinions on this. What do the others think, or can we reach consensus, or should we decide that to take a vote here to give the planning director some guidance?
Charles, I can just add from the committee's perspective, typically that was our thought process with special exception, was it was not to deny the usage, and in fact, legally it's still a use by right. It just, for things that we thought might impact the neighborhood more, it would allow for that public input while not denying the use. And so this is an example of where I personally don't necessarily have a preference on whether it's by right or special exception, but the reason we put it by special exception, and Sarah, if I'm recalling incorrectly, please let me know, but it was just, again, recognizing that it might be more impactful than certain other uses, and so giving the community a chance to respond without discriminating against the application, just to Adam's point, putting in potential safeguards for anything that might affect the public.
It's essentially adding another point in the process.
So I guess I'll just add to your point, Charles, I'm fine with how it's written for R2.
Okay, so other opinions?
I suppose a special exception makes the most sense, just so you get another look at reviewing the use and any standards you might want to include. So I agree with the draft.
Then I think we have a clear majority, but go ahead, Sarah, sorry.
I was just going to say, I also support leaving it as special exception for the R2, but I would be interested in returning to the point that Jenny made previously about other areas in the borough, whether or not it should be by right or special exception.
Okay, then let's move forward with our recommendation as written and move to dwelling, student housing, institutional. If you note in this chart, in the R2, student dwelling is accepted by right in the R2, dwelling dwelling student housing by special exception, dwelling student housing institutional by right. I'm going to start with my opinion on this one. What a tough topic, because we live in a college town. and I see a lot of college-related people in this room. I also know that there are goods and not so goods about living near student dwellings. And I wonder if our planning director or solicitor could advise us if we did want to restrict more, which I think I'm supportive of doing in residential districts in our community, whether this would put us into any trouble. So what I'm saying is I take Ms. Sipperly's point very much to heart about what it's like to live in proximity to student dwellings. And yet, also knowing that some of those student dwellings are very good additions to the neighborhood, and some are not. So could the two of you speak to this issue before we have Planning Commission respond?
One of the aspects that we really haven't discussed, and probably for good reason, when it comes to social organizations with students, our current ordinance really defines fraternity and sorority. It's limiting. It doesn't account for other student-centered bases of, I guess, residing or just occupying spaces for economic purposes. Most of the challenges that I've experienced with the borough in the past year as it relates to the R1 district in particular, but R2 and all of our residential districts, it is this interplay where you have basically they're kind of like a fraternity house, kind of like an apartment building, but it's definitely something that's disruptive, or at least it's causing residents to have concern and bring it to our attention. Other jurisdictions, in looking at the American Planning Association's Planner's Dictionary, one of the things when it comes to fraternities, find it, their fraternal organization, we don't necessarily have to limit it to those organizations that are associated with Greek life. Some of these definitions, I mean, this one out of, where was it? It was in Illinois. Yes, a building where fraternity, a building where organized male students are provided meals or lodging. You can also have more targeted to just groups associated with the college. That may be something that could alleviate some of the issues we've experienced recently with, there was a recent transfer of property on Broadway that has raised some concern with the neighborhood. Something that if we had had a stronger definition for fraternity or fraternity house, we may have been able to avoid that in that R1 district, but also making sure that if we have it as a special exception in the R2 district, that would be something that where we could really make sure that these properties are being utilized in a manner that's not only beneficial for the residents, but beneficial for the community.
John, on the topic of fraternities and sororities, since that is explicitly mentioned in the description of student housing,
Yeah.
right? You list those two items. Is there a way to think about this in that we already have a certain number of fraternities and sororities in Gettysburg and we can manage at that level, and they would not disappear if this changes, but that we would not add any more? That by restricting it, it does not eliminate the current ones, but it prevents the spreading of taking additional housing stock out of commission to be used in this way.
You're providing for the land use, so it can happen in the borough of Gettysburg. To the extent of the proliferation, it's your overview, your jurisdiction to provide the recommendation to council to establish how much of that specific land use and where it can occur in the borough. That's the basis of this discussion. So,
I think you want to bear in mind too, you're having this discussion on the basis of zone, not the basis of property. So you're looking at something within the zone, what should we do, not block by block, house by house.
Okay, so what does the group think of this? The recommendation that we have from the public to eliminate student housing from R2.
Personally, I don't really think that's necessary. I'd also want to explore the idea that fraternities and sororities are called out specifically, but technically within this ordinance, they're actually subsets of the two other types of housing, of student housing and of student housing institutional. There is no fraternity and sorority use. They are just parts of the other one. So for student housing, it seems to be a privately owned residence that is being leased out to students, one of those which might be a fraternity or sorority, but also could just be, other students. And then there is, again, student housing institutional, which the difference there is it seems to be managed by the college institution. So I personally am fine with the ordinance as written. I think a couple things I would just caution is one, let's look at those specific instances, but also two, is this another example where potentially instead of it being by right for student housing institutional, it becomes special exception as well? Again, not denying the use, but giving the community that would be impacted additional input if something new were to be planned for that area. So in this instance where, let's say, a property was purchased and was trying to be used for student housing, there would have to be that process and other things put in place. I just think a lot of the issues brought up about student housing are things that students might do, sure, but are also things that anyone of this community might do, right? Being loud, being obtrusive, being obnoxious. And we have other ways to deal with that in other ordinances, right? We have noise ordinances, we have other things, form and function. And so it's, to me, why not just use those other things, right? If you live near student housing, I understand that can be frustrating, but if they're being loud, if they're not doing what they're supposed to do, those are other things that every member of this community needs to do, and there are other recourses for dealing with that, because I think there are students that are positive members of the community. I lived in a few different areas of this town, and for me, the worst area was, I lived by the Gary Owen, which is, it's not students, it's just loud people in town. And so to me, it just seems really aggressive towards students who I think are a big part of this community. And again, if they're allowed, use the noise ordinance. So that's just my personal stance. But again, I think if there is complaint against that being in the ordinance, there are steps between leaving it in and getting rid of it completely. Using the special exception and looking at the definition of student housing, I think, is important.
Okay, so let's build on that. Nick has somewhat of a compromised view of making the institutional by special exception. We will talk about R1 on item 3 here coming up, but I just want to note that in the R1 district, student housing is not permitted anymore. So that means if the fraternity would decide to sell, it could not sell to another fraternity. If any of the R1 fraternities, that's not the case?
Same use, right? It would be a continuation.
Oh, a continuation of the use. Okay.
In the event, the way that these generally would happen is you'd have a fraternal organization that's like kicked off campus, in which case then you might have a situation where the use has been abandoned for a year, and then it would have to either revert to a multifamily or some kind of, usually they're designed very uniquely, so it's a tricky thing to actually make them work.
Okay, so it is the case, though, that we are prohibiting future properties in the R1 from turning into student housing while allowing it in the R2. Now, Nick suggests special exception. What do others think about the R2 district in this question? Marty?
In the old ordinance, student housing is listed under special exception, and I think that's how it should be.
I wanted to ask, it seems like the definition is unclear to me because it says the owner, which I think can be determined clearly by looking at the property deed, or person responsible 21 years or over shall live on the premises. How would the borough be determining who is the person responsible?
So this would be similar to our rental registration process. We have to have someone on file that's either local or property manager.
But does that mean that some college parents could buy a house and say that their 22-year-old senior is the person responsible for the house, and that then it becomes permissible because that's right? So right. I think I think that definition could have some improvement, And I also realize that the borough wouldn't want the responsibility necessarily of trying to make that determination of who is the person, a person responsible. So anyways, yeah, I just wanted to clarify.
Can you look at that definition?
Yeah, and that's, so with that direction, if everyone's okay with that, I'll look to change the definition of student housing so we have some more relevant discussion on it next month.
Again, we will have more time in a few minutes, but anybody else on Planning Commission on this topic of, it sounds like there's some movement here. I think I personally would still like to be more restrictive. However, I realize we are in a college community, and maybe we should talk more about what the college interests are in their own housing. I understand maybe they are interested in bringing more students on campus, and do we need a need for more housing in our neighborhoods filled with students? However, it sounds like 2 members of the board are interested in special exception, so that might be where we go on this, but do others have any comments?
I just might add that not only is it special exception, but it lays out 3 requirements for special exception in the old ordinance. It has to be located adjacent to an institutional district, being the college, parking requirements, and a buffer yard for any existing families. So they lay out some requirements there. I don't know if any part of our ordinance includes additional requirements for special exception currently in the proposed.
I'd have to get through it. Generally, we do have a few other uses that have similar, like parking and buffer requirements, but it's few and far between.
Right. I mean, the chart's nice, you get the special exception, but the old ordinance did lay out additional requirements there, so.
Thanks for bringing that up. So Marty and Nick are moving in that direction. Sarah, Jenny, do you have any comments before we move to the next item?
I agree with special exception.
All right, so I'm a little bit alone. I'm wanting to be more restrictive. However, we are changing R to special exception, John, if that's okay. Okay, let's move to motel. Well, no, I'm sorry. Let's go back to the chart if you want to pull that back up. And we've moved through the residential uses. There is a concern about lodging uses. Currently in the R2, in the proposed ordinance for the R2, we are permitting bed and breakfast, and we are permitting motel by special exception. A community member has raised a concern with both of those items. Does the Planning Commission have reaction? This is R2, bed and breakfast, and motels, special exception.
I'll just speak a little bit to motel, because I do remember talking about that one in the committee. I think our intention was, knowing that motel is such a specific use, but that there clearly are motels in these R2 districts, right? They're currently college housing, but they were motels, right? They look like motels, they are motels. And so by our intention of allowing motel in R2 was with the kind of understanding that it was pretty unlikely that a property would be purchased to be turned into a motel, just simply by square footage requirements in the motel definition. It was more to allow that if the college, let's say, were to sell one of the existing motel properties that exist in R2, that someone could come in and operate it as a motel, because that's what it is, without doing a ton of renovations or something to make that something else. So I think that's what we were talking about. And so that was my understanding as a committee member of kind of why we were allowing motel in R2. It was really just to allow what truly are motels to potentially be used as motels in the future if the college decides to sell them. And again, looking at the definition of motel, I think it's the square footage required for it. It's very unlikely that new motels would be put into R2 because there just aren't parcels that exist that fit that requirement. And so, not to say that, I mean, I think if people are upset by that, a conversation can happen, but just to give a little bit of background of why we were initially including motel in the R2 usage, it was thinking about those properties.
So I understand that you're responding to the already built structures in the R2, and okay. So I understand that. I do, going to bed and breakfast, I know what the discussion of this topic is in the R1 district, and I want to respect the R2 district for the same reason, that taking housing offline, which is different from what you're describing in motel, I think for bed and breakfast, that's more likely to be removing housing that people could live in and turning them into bed and breakfast. So I'd love to hear the staff recommendation on why we would encourage that through this use in the R2, because I'm of the mind of removing that from the R2.
So the bed and breakfast is unique when compared to the other vacation or short-term rental uses. Someone has to actually be a permanent resident of the structure, so it's going to be more akin to an extra income coming into the property. As with the R1A, the idea is for property preservation. Some of our larger structures in the R2 it may be challenging to maintain those structures going forward without additional income coming into the property.
I see a compromise there with special exception in R2, and I'm thinking of one particular building on Lincoln, East Lincoln, that has in the past been a bed and breakfast. It's not currently, but the way it's configured with bathrooms for every bedroom is generally unique. And it could be if it were sold in the future. Again, that property owner's not here.
Do we know how many B&Bs are in the R2 currently?
I did not do that analysis, no. We can get you that information for next month.
So this isn't a change, though?
No.
Marty, you have that page open. It's not a change to the...
As far as I know, bed and breakfasts are not permitted yet. Is that, no,
So it
under
is-
special exception.
Okay, under special exception. So Jenny's making a proposal to do that here. Again, I'm of the mind that these residential districts, to me, have a hard time if you have, even with a property owner living there, and I don't think that is highly regulated. I think that that's not happening everywhere, but I know that it's supposed to. And so it doesn't seem to be supporting the mission of the R2 to have that, but I take the position, I mean, I understand what the others are arguing there. How do we want to move? What do you think, Marty or Nick or Sarah, on the bed and breakfast, and then we'll get back to the motel?
I say this from a perspective of, I think anyone who's gone to any of these meetings knows I'm for more housing, and so I agree with you, Charles. I would personally remove it as a use to encourage more housing in any district, including R2.
I would allow for special exception.
Well, it's up to you, Sarah, for being democratic.
Special exception.
Okay. All right. Please also remember, as I mentioned, that the Borough Council ultimately votes on this, but we want to do the best job we can in making this our own document. And so consensus is the best way, but it doesn't always work. So that's why we have to do these votes like this. So let's change it to special exception, please, for R2. And now, how about motel? We had Nick's point about we already have some things, but that's just like two buildings, right?
And we can pull up the map, but I believe there's 4 motels along Carlisle Street, right? There's Paxton, Smizer, Laum, and Colonial. Paxton is the 2-story at the corner of Lincoln and Carlisle, and then Laum's across, or Smizer's across the street, 1-story. There's that building next to the funeral home, that's 1-story, and then there's a 2-story on the corner of Water and Carlisle as well. But again, I just looked up the definition for motel, and it needs 10,000 feet, 10,000 square feet. So I think that's pretty hard to find elsewhere in R2. So I doubt there's any new motels coming up. I guess someone could buy like 5 properties and combine them, but I don't know, seems unlikely to me. And again, we were just trying to avoid that property just being stuck,
Yeah.
right? If the college no longer needs it and they're trying to sell it, if you couldn't use it as a motel, you'd have to do a lot of work to those lots to make something else happen.
Okay. Thoughts on that from the commission?
Hearing Nick's reasoning, I think that makes sense to leave it as special exception.
Can we get some, can John, you give us some confirmation that there are not some other structures out there where there's 10,000 feet that might turn into a motel? And that's probably, like, you don't have every parcel committed to memory, but.
I mean, that's any of the, I mean, a quarter acre parcel, then you'd be able to have a motel. So it's not, these aren't huge properties, but most of the ones in the R2 district, especially when you're looking at the core of the borough, I mean, these are very small parcels, generally a tenth of an acre. They would not be eligible, and we wouldn't necessarily expect it. The only parcel I'm thinking would possibly be the Foursquare Church property, if you actually consolidate.
We're going to get to that. Yeah. Okay.
So that might be the only one, but that would be more.
Churches rare. Well, I shouldn't say. No, I won't. I said churches rarely close, but that might not be true all across. Sarah or Marty, on the topic of this motel, we have an argument here to keep it a special exception. Sarah said she agrees. Marty?
I don't feel strongly one way or another, so yeah, special exception sounds.
Okay, so it sounds like the majority, or the vast group wants to, I remain concerned if there would be other parcels. So again, we will not vote on the final recommendation. If we do our research and it turns out that, wait, other places could be in jeopardy of this happening, then we can always revisit it before the final vote. Let's now, are there anything else under lodging uses that the commission wants to raise that is either add or delete from the R2? Okay, how about civic and institutional uses? Anything that the commission wants to add or eliminate from here? And I won't go through the rest unless you have anything else. Yeah, go ahead.
Talk about the place of worship? Commissioner by right. Is that what you're going to bring on the plate, I guess?
Oh, that's just the map. Okay. Where he wants to be. I don't think we have to do that now. We're going to talk about that with the map. There's nothing else on Ms. Sipperly's list that I see about use, but you can tell us if there is in a second when we go back to public comment. So I'm ready to move to standards, unless there's anything else on R2 uses that the commission wants to raise. All right, then let's go to page 32, where the standards for the R2 are outlined. This proposal hasn't really changed at all since we last looked at it, but this would be an opportunity to make changes. Is anyone uncomfortable with any of the standards related to building height, lot configuration, and setbacks and parking for the R2, which is on page 32? Anything from staff that you want to say about standards?
No, this is just generally a continuation of the current ordinance requirements. Basically, you will have medium-sized houses on small-sized parcels. As you can see, the area that you can have a structure, especially if it's a townhouse or attached dwelling, very small yards, so it is more of an urbanized development standard that you'd see around the old town district.
Okay. Just want to note the maximum building height in the R2 is 45 feet. That's 3 stories. I would guess that most of those structures are actually 36 feet and 2 stories,
Yeah.
with a few that are 45. This might become important later on when we get to another district. But let's move now to the map and the question that related, or the comments that Mr. Schmitz made related to Foursquare Church. John, could you talk us through that and whether we want to make a change to the map related to what we just heard?
Well, in looking at looking at the borough's land use, the R2 district allows for places of worship as a use. So the district standard is, it wouldn't change it from what's currently permitted. The ability to market a property for sale, I mean, that's pretty extraneous from what you're doing right now, because in looking at the zoning map, you're going to be affecting the property value for every property in the borough. That's the business the borough is actually in, is the land business. We want to make sure that the property is being optimized in the best way possible. As a place of worship use, there are number of sub-activities that can occur that are still within that use category. Now, it does become challenging when we recognize the decline in attendance for these facilities, especially, I mean, with what's going on with the Methodist Church. There's others that have folded. These structures, the problem that we run into is adaptive reuse of a church building is very tricky. There are tax credit programs that could be utilized to make housing out of a church. But unless it's, I mean, there can be real problems if there is difficulty in transferring it.
Would you mind just circling where this is on that map so we can see how it fits in the districts? What I heard the gentleman say was not that they're worried about or interested in reselling. In fact, he said they have a lot of people going to that church. I think it was he was making some argument that
It's just the opposite, that there's too many people going to the church.
okay.
In 2016, it was rebuilt, but it was rebuilt probably too small. And if you go by on Sunday.
Oh, I see. Okay.
This park is, that whole area is street parking, full, it's crowded because of the activities during the week. It used to be very crowded. And the concern was if it keeps growing and it outgrows that building, where do you go? How do you handle
Okay, so that's the concern. Not that it would be resold, but that it might have to expand, and it wouldn't be possible to expand in that district.
Well, it could expand. I understand it. The most logical would be to buy other properties and convert them.
Okay.
It
Okay.
takes them out of residential. But the Pedori property, right next door, that would be one possibility. The thought was, if you could sell that property, then perhaps you could find another property, such as the seminary, that would have ability to have a green field.
Okay, that helps to extend that comment, but your reaction to that, John? Thank you.
I mean, I don't really want to make a hot take.
Right.
Overall,
just
the properties around, I mean, there is a GC property that abuts this parcel. It wouldn't be spot zoning then to expand the district.
Well, that's what I wanted you to show the map for, that we weren't encouraging spot zoning
Yeah.
here.
So, I mean, you can get away with it. One of the challenges with any future development of this parcel is going to be the floodplain. I mean, that really creates just general issues for development on site. But overall, I mean, it's your choice. This would be an expansion of the general commercial. That's something that one of the issues that can occur is just the expansion of commercial into residential in general. Land values can become affected when you start expanding that district for the adjoining properties further around. So it's just something to keep in mind. But if the Planning Commission is in favor of modifying the map to have that GC district in these parcels here, that will not be an issue.
Okay, so this is the first that I'm hearing, I think this is the first that we're all hearing about this request?
No, they've been making this request for a while now. It's been lumped into a few other requests for the Middle Street area that we've heard from other property owners. Most of these are not requests for, I guess, the promotion of keeping their existing use class or existing use standards. It's requesting a new district classification to enable a different valuation of the property. So that's the nuts and bolts of it. Is you really shouldn't be making decisions based on the financial interest of the parties. At the same time, you can, with these parcels, make a change to the general commercial that would not upset the district standards for the surrounding area.
I just wanted to ask a question because I'm a little bit confused about the concern, because places of worship are permitted by right in R2, and they're surrounded by R2. So they would be able to expand. So But pardon? Okay.
I understand that it's about this, the lot size, the setbacks that would be more conducive. I don't know. I have not studied this, so my instincts are to wait and do any map changes at our next meeting and not at this meeting. Because I understand it not to be use, but to be what kind of building they want in the future potentially. Is it okay if we wait and do this at the November meeting, as well as any other map things that have come up recently? So, sir, we'll return to this at the November meeting and when we revisit the map. Are there, that gets us through to that gets us through R2. So let's move now to supplemental regulations, and John.
Public comment?
After supplemental.
So with supplemental regulations, this is it's the odds and ends, so to speak, of the zoning ordinance. Just pull it up, maybe. This is part 4.
And this is page 140 in the zoning ordinance proposal. 140.
Thank you. Yes. So the supplemental regulations have the effect of tweaking many of the protocols that are in the district standards and in the general definitions. Most of these have been ported over from the existing ordinance. So we can, if it makes sense, we can just go through each bullet point.
Yeah, go for it.
401. So 401 begins with access to structures. Basically, you have to have access to the property through either a public right-of-way or some form of right-of-way easement, and then also allowing that there be access to the building. That's something that's generally it's more than a good idea. It's a requirement generally with subdivision ordinances to have that type of access. Accessory buildings and structures. This is when we begin talking about the sheds, garages, the requirements associated for those sub-use type of buildings. When it comes to detached garages, we do try to make a case that they should be utilized for vehicle storage. Additionally, in looking at the actual height of the garage, it's only allowed to be 25 feet. That's in keeping with the other height standards for accessory dwellings, so you can't have a multi-story accessory structure. You could theoretically get up to 3 stories, but those would be very small stories. In looking at your accessory buildings, you're often going to be looking at structures that utilize this textured 111 siding. Additionally, you have a greenhouse design, so you're going to have a structure that's not necessarily going to meet the current built environment. So as protocol for that, the historic district's design standards come into play whenever these are cited. And those requirements, in my practice with the borough, we have seen a few instances where HARB has worked with the property owners to make a design for an accessory structure that actually meets what's going on with the larger context of the block. It's an instance we had earlier this year involved the initial request is for a shipping container as an accessory structure, which you can do that if you strap it down. It becomes an accessory to the property, and you can have it platted with a deed. However, it's a shipping container, so it's not necessarily going to have that aesthetic that we would expect to see, especially in our tourism districts. So that was something that HARB worked through, and we came to a very nice building. The accessory buildings have to meet our lot standards and our coverage requirements as they relate to percent of open space on the property. This comes into play especially with stormwater management regulations, as these do count as impervious surface. Build two lines. This was one we've had comment on earlier. Build two lines are generally a method of establishing a building setback. The idea of the building setback is you want to have your structure generally uniform throughout the entire block. It creates a visual cue. You also have a better sense of place when you're in an area that has, I'm going to use the ALA language, the rhythm and harmony of buildings that are built in accordance, as opposed to situations where you see large yards right next to a house that might be right on the front. It creates visual challenges. It also impacts light characteristics on those other parcels. So one of the things we try to do is make sure that all the houses are built to a general uniformity throughout a block. This could be expressed as a front setback in lieu of a build two line. It's just been the practice of the borough to utilize the terminology for build two lines. So as you can see, there are some instances where you can have structures that are designed a little bit differently, especially as it relates to access to the structure. Generally, we're utilizing this vary up to 4 feet. We're thinking about physical proximity of how much the space that an individual is going to take up. Driveways. So in utilizing driveways, we have to ensure that we're providing off-street parking, but also access to off-street parking. So it's just some of the provisions associated with where they can be provided on site, especially when looking at the locations and near intersections or other driveways, so you don't have vehicles backing out into oncoming traffic that would be more prone to hitting them if they're engaged in a turning maneuver. Existing single-family attached dwellings, so these are townhomes. Basically, it provides for just that general usage throughout the borough. And the next one is the single-family semi-attached dwellings. That's your two families.
Okay, so there are 21 of these, and you've just gone through 6. Can we just pause for a second to see if there are questions? And we'll pause every 5 or so.
Okay.
So any questions on the 6 that John has reviewed for us?
Why aren't these in Saldo?
Many of them could be in the subdivision land development ordinance. It's just it's regulating it from that use characteristic as opposed to the parcel design characteristic. Again, it's doing this. If we regulated these instances through Saldo, we would only be capturing those properties that actually go through the subdivision land development process. It's not going to capture those single-family and two-family dwellings, because they're generally going to already be in existence, or they're going to be just redeveloped in such a manner that it's permitted by right. There's no UCC code reviews. It becomes a little bit more tricky to get every single property without having these types of regulations also put into the zoning ordinance. So, sorry, long-winded way of saying it just makes it better.
I think Chad wants to.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And just to add on what John just said, it's important to note that Saldo is only triggered whenever you have land development. We also have a street and sidewalk ordinance, and you might remember a few years ago, Planning Commission started engaging into adding driveway ordinance standards into the street and sidewalk ordinance, which is probably the best place for it. We've never pushed that effort across the goal line. So for now, I would suggest you keep that driveway standards in here. Should we push that effort across the goal line with a new street and sidewalk ordinance, then at that time, these standards for driveways may need to be rescinded from, we have to edit the zoning ordinance, but for now, I would suggest you keep them in as a placeholder.
Anyone else? Okay, you can keep going, John. I don't have anything.
Okay, moving ahead, fences. This provides for location and height of fencing. In particular, we're looking for fences to be less than 6 feet in height. Those that are in the front yard are even shorter at 4 feet. In terms of the materials, those are all going to be reviewed by HARB if the property is in the historic district. And fences in particular can be something that we have challenges with, but when we observe them going in or when we get the building permit, we make sure that we're reviewing it and that historic architectural review board is involved with the design to ensure that we don't have stockade fencing going up in our historic properties. Maintenance of common areas, facilities, and open space. This is requirement for homeowners associations for certain provisions. In particular, making sure that it provides for us to actually regulate homeowners associations' activities in addition to property maintenance code. Nonconformities. This is a pretty important aspect and section of the ordinance. This deals with all those properties that over time they've changed, either as a result of the ordinance changing, the use changing, the district requirements changing, the parcel being subdivided. Lots of things have changed over time. Eventually, the nonconformity may exist. This provides the method by which the nonconformity shall exist. Generally, the expansion of a nonconformity is going to require zoning hearing board approval. Additionally, there are provisions where if there's a casualty event for the structure, so a fire or some kind of substantial damage situation, making sure that there are periods in place for the restoration. These are ported over from our current ordinance. One of the things to keep in mind, we have a number of very old properties that make retrofits and such that become substantial, the cost of improving these properties in such a manner that if the Planning Commission wanted to encourage development, there are certain things we can do to incentivize that those properties that, while they may be older, they may be in a state of deterioration. So making sure that those properties are upkept. There are some things we could do, but we're not getting into that with this ordinance. This is just general standardized non-conforming parcels, uses, and structures. With that, I guess the next one deals with on-lot storage in residential districts. Basically, you really shouldn't be storing stuff. And that ends up becoming a property maintenance code issue if it's exterior storage and it's present and being observed by our code enforcement officer. So this provides for another level of enforcement and also engages, there's the parking or storage of a licensed automobile in the front yard area shall only be on a driveway, making sure individuals are parking on driveways as opposed to parking in the yard. That actually is there's a complementary ordinance provisions that assists with our stormwater management requirements as they relate to municipal sanitary sewer requirements. You're not allowed to be having effluent and discharge into our sewer system, and that can occur when fluids and such are being going into the ground. If you'd like, we can do
we can do one more.
Yeah, one more. Okay, so the next one then is performance standards. No use or activity shall be permitted that will create any dangerous, injurious, noxious, or otherwise objectionable situation. And so basically, these are your civil disturbances. Can't be like explosions. You can't have heavy industrial activities occurring in close proximity to individuals. It's if these are the comments we get that usually when we receive these complaints, we investigate them through the code enforcement officer, and we work to create a learning environment for the offending party. Often we don't have a real problem where we have to go through the citation process with these types of nuisances.
Okay, so we got 5 more. Are there any comments? I think maybe on 409, we should certainly have some comment, given how many nonconformities we have in the borough. Does anyone have any thoughts on that one or any of the others that John just reviewed? Marty, I feel like you have things to say about 409.
Well, I was wondering if Chad might speak to this. I know with our sidewalks and the stoops that come out, I don't know if this can be addressed here or should be addressed, but I was just wondering where that might fit in with any of this.
I think that is the same conversation I just mentioned about the street and sidewalk ordinance. We did start it built into there, and that's probably the appropriate place to have that kind of language. So I don't know if I have any issues with the way it's currently read. There's, a lot of this nonconformity it's a pretty common thing in the borough. There's a lot of properties with a lot of existing nonconformities. So you have to have some language in there to allow for people to continue to do those kind of things. And you got to have limitations on how much they're allowed to expand those things. I think Marty brings up a good point that's kind of always been one of my vendettas, the ramps that go out into the sidewalks and take up the public space. But I think the sidewalk ordinance is the appropriate place for that. So I'd love to revisit that another day.
When it comes to damaged concrete on the private property, that would be a property maintenance code issue then. But yeah, when it's in the public right-of-way, that the sidewalk section, as opposed to zoning, would be the method that we fix any of the problems. In particular, the nonconformities, there can be situations where like parking and things like that are certain aspects of the activities associated with the land use could deteriorate. When that occurs, we work with the property owner, and if there's instances where it is occurring, please bring it to staff's attention, because that would be something. There's generally other code issues that are more, I would say, actionable that we can address at the same time.
Thank you.
Is this process for granting certificates of nonconformity followed?
It has not been followed to my experience. Generally, what we would do, we provide, when an individual asks for a determination of use, we have a minor zoning certification that we can provide. That would be then establishing this is your nonconformity, this is what's currently required in the district, this is where the defect is, so to speak. But yeah, we do not do there is no formal registration that's been occurring. It's something we can do. We do have access to Google Street View, went through in 2023, 2024. Most of our older imaging maps go back to 2012, so we have a pretty good grasp on the way properties have looked in the borough. It would be something, I mean, we get a lot of property data, so it'd be something else that we can do, but we haven't been doing it to date.
Okay, other comments on these last 5 or 6? Okay, then keep going, John. 2 more rounds. Well, we'll have time right after this. Right after this, we have public comment again, right after this.
Next one's parking. This is a pretty big one. So parking in particular, one of the comments we received is that the space design is smaller than UCC code requirements. So we do have a 9-foot width by 18-foot length. UCC is a 10 by 20. You can go even smaller. Generally, that's going to be associated with parallel parking. And you can even go shorter when you have compact parking. So having parking that aligns with vehicles that are popular is a benefit. Having parking that aligns with the vehicles that the community wants to see in their neighborhoods is also of a benefit. You are under no obligation to provide parking that F-350 dually can easily fit into and do a lap around the lot. I mean, you don't have to do that. And looking at urban environments, you generally do have parking spaces that are in the 9 to 18 or smaller. I've worked in jurisdictions where they've been as small width as 7.5 feet. Does it make for more compact spaces? Yes. That was what the community wanted. They didn't want large trucks on the streets. In terms of, we have the provisions for bicycle parking. These are in keeping with standards, specifically making sure the bike can physically fit onto or be placed onto the rack. Parking spaces, we do a maximum space permitted. This is a change from a minimum. The idea being situation where you imagine the Walmart parking lot that's only ever going to be full on 5 Saturdays before Christmas. That's something that the maximum parking space provision tries to alleviate. The other, I guess, big trend in planning is to have no standards for parking. I'm a little wishy-washy on that with my practice. I think the maximum standard provides the best regulation, and you avoid a situation where you have land uses that are created that do not have adequate parking, which is something that there is nothing more frustrating to your customers if they can't find parking and they let you know, and then we get the comments and complaints. It's not to say it's a problem that can't be remedied by individuals walking, but it's something that individuals complain about, and we have to be cognizant of that. So in doing this, we went through most of the residential uses. The idea was to have 2 per unit. In terms of the lodging uses, you're looking at usually 1 space per guest room and providing for employee parking. With regards to the civic and institutional uses, these are the ones that can be the most challenging, especially when you think of places of worship or I don't know if funeral home is included with this one, but cemetery. You can have surge events where there's a lot of traffic. It's going to be infrequent, so it's one of those things where we really go back to parking analysis to provide the best information. That information, it's going to be provided by an engineering firm, and then they can at least provide you with daytime, AM, PM traffic flows and levels of service to establish what the use is going to be doing, not only to the parking on the site, but also to the traffic outside the property. When we get to the commercial uses, we've tried to stay away from the voodoo science of having spaces per square foot. Really just trying to have a space for the employee and a space for the customer. Looking at some of these uses, we do have the 1 per 200 for a lot of the restaurant uses. That makes sense. It gets challenging because you're looking at the use as a table per table, how many cars are going to be coming per the number of seats available. So we did have to maintain it for certain land uses. Let's see. Most of the provisions, revitalization for the revitalization zone and for Old Town, we provide for those uses to not have to provide parking. Since the borough does provide parking resources, both with right-of-way, on the street parking, and then the parking garage. We have this little provision at the very end. In the case where a use is not provided, the zoning officer may make a determination on the number of parking spaces for a comparable use. Looking at some of the uses, we have tried to stay away from the voodoo science of having spaces per square foot. Really just trying to go back to parking analysis to provide the best information. if it becomes, in practice, if it becomes challenging, what we would do is we would get a recommendation from the applicant, and if necessary, take it to the zoning hearing board for determination. That hasn't happened in my practice here with the borough, but it would be something if necessary. We do allow for on-street parking to count towards parking requirements. So that's parking that's provided then by the borough to allow for private use. But it's not necessarily going to be guaranteed parking, so that's when you have the meters. We have ADA parking spaces. There are specific design criteria required for the number of spaces depending on the size of a parking lot, and then the design of those spaces with requirements, the striped area requirements, if it's a universal space, if it's a van space, or if it's a standard space. So there are provisions provided in the ADA legislation. We're trying to reference that with these requirements. And then, as you can see, we have the minimum number of required accessible spaces per total parking spaces. Most of our larger automotive-based land uses are on Steinway. So our general commercial areas are where we're going to see these parking lots being developed in the future. I don't think we're going to be at a position where we're going to have 1,000 or 500 space lots, but we'd go up that high for determination for informational purposes. Determination of the space, how we actually do that, including we were going to be looking at just beyond the initial provisions provided in the ordinance. We're also going to be looking at hours of operation for the business and specific characteristics associated with how the land use will be occurring. And then there's provisions to allow for the zoning officer and borough engineer to make parking determinations. We allow for a reduction in the number of parking spaces. There's certain criteria that allows for that incentive. Location to transit facilities, public parking facilities, Gettysburg Air Loop right-of-way being dedicated, location of bicycle parking, and then dedicated vehicle share services. Requirements for location of parking. Basically, it has to be in the general vicinity of the land use it's associated with. We have a 1,000-foot standard. There are, this is actually pretty loose in that regard, so you can have your parking off-premise. It does not necessarily require going through numerous bureaucratic hoops to be able to utilize the off-premise and shared parking. Shared parking, you can have depending on how different businesses may have different operational times, so you may be able to utilize one lot for multiple businesses in a manner that you're having effective and optimized usage, and that we encourage that. And there we have the shared parking calculations, how that usage will occur, time frames and whatnot.
Okay, before we get to swimming pools, let's just talk about parking, since that was a whole lot, John.
Yes.
That's a lot. Just so you know, before you were here, there was a trend among this body to do exactly, I think, some of the things you've laid out here, which is to not to require parcels to have more parking than they need. So that had been a trend that we had already practiced. And secondly, though, and some of that was to also encourage public transit and public parking. But there were areas of the borough that it's clear that by doing that, it creates perhaps congestion and traffic. So I just raised that as a general point, not specific to anything you mentioned, but maybe others on here have more specifics to respond to on this provision related to parking. I know you do.
I have a couple questions. I wanted to voice my support, first of all, for the idea you mentioned of reducing the required size of a single parking space, but that wouldn't apply to street parking, is that right? or how does the borough determine the size of its parallel parking spaces on the streets?
So page 152 of the document. Yeah.
7 by 20 is the minimum. That's pretty small.
Well, because, well, we have 9 by 18
That's for off-street.
Yeah.
off-street, okay. So what do you say, what is it for parallel?
Yeah, a bona fide on-street parking space shall measure at least 7 feet in width and 20 feet in length.
That allows for those. So 20 feet's pretty short for on-street parking, but allows the end parking spaces to only be 20 feet. Then usually the ones in between are a little bit bigger. But that's the same standard as it's always been. And we have a lot of spaces in the borough that are 7 by 20.
What's the trend towards parallel parking with cars that are basically doing it for you? Is that, I mean, I've never had a problem parallel parking, but it seems like, I know people do feel uncomfortable doing it, but John, you mentioned this idea that, like, can we fit more cars on the streets if we adapt to, if we park better and adapt to what modern cars are helping people do it for them?
I mean, I guess theoretically, yes, but I can tell you that we've tried to pack them in as much as we've been able to. There's not a whole lot of room. You might be able to find a place or two where you can fit an extra space, but there's not going to be too many of those.
And this is totally off topic, I realize at this point, but does the borough provide any spaces for things like smart cars or motorcycles where, you know, we do have spaces particularly for smaller vehicles, or we don't need to provide a 20-foot long space? No?
That I know of, no.
Yeah, okay, I was curious. Okay, my other question was about the bicycle parking. Because it talks about property owners shall provide and maintain required bicycle parking, but the only place I could figure out where it would be required was would be as if they are reducing their parking spaces. Is that what it applies to? It's really just when you are reducing your car parking spaces, then you have to meet those rules for bicycle parking? Okay. We're not requiring bicycle parking anywhere by itself.
Not in this ordinance, but
Okay.
it would be something we can discuss with Salvo.
Other comments about parking or questions?
Maybe, I'm wondering, most zoning things fall into, when you're going for a variance, that would be dimensional or use. What would this fall under, or what's the likelihood of granting a variance when discussing these?
So if the applicant were requesting more parking than what's permitted?
Or less. Yeah.
Or less, okay. Applicant may authorize additional parking. Okay, so they do have the ability to get they can get a parking analysis to establish that. Generally, yeah, I mean, if you have an engineering report showing that you need this much parking, or that you can get away with having less parking, and it makes sense, then it provides the zoning hearing board the, I guess, finding of fact. It provides the steps to making a positive determination. They don't have to. And generally, it's going to be challenging. I would imagine it'd be challenging for the applicant to prove a hardship, especially if they're requesting less parking. So it's generally going to be a financial reason, but if they're able to make a justification based on the use of the property and how other similar land uses operate, it really makes it an easier determination by the ZHB.
I would suspect, Marty, if they were doing that, you would probably be, it would be treated more like a use variance, I think, because you would be saying, there's supplemental regulations in the ordinance saying that you need to have X number of parking spaces. We don't think we need that many. That would probably be the basis for a variance request more than we want smaller parking spaces, which would at that point be dimensional. I don't know that I've ever seen that, but I think that's how it would be analyzed.
So John's going to pull up the section that covers, because again, this is a maximum permitted use. So if you want to have more than what is the maximum permitted, it would be approved by special exception by the ZHB. And that's there at B. No, it starts with notwithstanding.
You're just asking what's the application for the ZHB?
Well, so if it's considered more use-oriented, then I think it would reason that it would be harder for zoning to approve a variance. So my temptation, I guess, is to make it a little easier for the applicant on parking requirements so that they don't have to, go for a zoning hearing board meeting, because if it is use, then that would be harder for zoning hearing board to approve, I suppose.
Well, by making it special exception, that makes it easier than a variance process. So as long as they're providing the information to the satisfaction of the zoning hearing board per this language, the zoning hearing board would approve. Like I said, there's always nuances to what's being argued, but if you have the information, there is going to be either a variance process, or we could make a special exception process that would make it easier. But as it is now for maximum parking, yes, we do have a special exception. If you want to have it to go below as well, we can include that language. So if the applicant wants to have fewer parking spaces than required.
So he's saying they are making it easier by doing special exception and not variance, but you want it to be even easier.
I guess I misunderstood. So it sounds like there is a potential for granting a variance then for parking requirements.
Are you talking about the number of spaces or the size of the spaces?
Number of spaces.
Yeah, and it's not variance, it would be a special exception.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Other parking comments? Nick and then Sarah.
Get out of here. When does the potential new, when would this trigger in somebody changing the use of their building, let's say, right? If you're changing the use and you already have 10 parking spaces, but your new use is 2 maximum, does that mean you have to get rid of them? Or is there something in here that I'm missing where it's you can, if you've got 10 parking spaces, even if you get an approved new use, you can leave those 10 spaces alone?
It depends on how the change of use were to come about. So at some point, there would be the expectation that the property is in conformance with the ordinance and that the excessive parking has either been remedied through zoning hearing board or it's been removed. So the expectation would be at the change of use process, we'd have a consolidated land use permit application that would trigger then this additional finding. Usually if it's going to be new construction, it would be the subdivision land development process that would initiate or instigate the need for parking. So that would be another instance where it's reviewed. But ultimately, the excessive number of parking spaces would have to come into conformity at some point.
I think my question sort of ties into that, because I was thinking about in the current zoning ordinance, the Old Town District is not required to provide parking for residential uses, I guess, or commercial uses, or certain businesses. And I think our Old Town District boundaries are changing significantly, so they could see some impact to that if their uses change, whether or not they would have to come into compliance with the new maximum standards.
It could, but most of the properties that are the zoning is changing with the relationship to the Old Town. Those properties are currently a single-family use, so there are going to be situations where, yeah, you might have a structure on a parcel that doesn't have any parking. They would still be able to use it, but what will eventually occur is if in a redevelopment scenario, they're either going to have to figure out a way to put parking on site or get a variance. And if there's a spatial component to the variance request, so like we cannot physically fit parking on our property, that's a justification for zoning hearing board to approve the variance. There's something unique about the property that is not felt by others in the district. So there would be at some point in the future, there would be a reconciliation that has to occur.
And then my other thing was I've been trying to understand this paragraph under parking space requirements that addresses the Old Town District, and I feel like it's not making sense to me, and I think maybe it's missing a word or something, but I just thought maybe you could, is it, okay, so there's something going on there.
There's something,
that it's not.
I have a note here to say, to
Okay.
mention it to John as well. I think it's a typo. I'm trying to find
What it was
how it was worded
intending.
in our
Okay.
The goal, I believe it was, she's looking at B1C. The idea was, again, when we had minimum numbers, we said, except for in the Old Town where you're allowed to have 0, any new establishment can never have 0. You can never use 0. That was the goal of the old ordinance. And it had been trying to reword it with a new maximum standard, and it's not worded properly. So there's a typo there.
Good catch.
Yep.
Final comments about parking. Okay, let's go to swimming pools and then do 5 or 6 more, please.
That was the real challenge.
Well, before you do that, all those questions were for clarification. Nobody has suggested any changes to the proposal under parking. Am I hearing that? Okay. Private swimming pools.
This provides that swimming pools in residential areas cannot be located in the front or side yard. Also the requirements with regards to view of the pool. They have to have, where is it? Any deck there's a 10-foot setback from the lot line. Recreational vehicle storage. 1, uninhabited recreational vehicle and transportable condition may be stored or parked on a lot outside of an enclosed building with the following limitations. And then we get into the length of time depending on the size of the vehicle. You cannot utilize the existing right-of-way for the storage. It has to be kept out of view from a public street or abutting dwelling. And there's some other provisions that the vehicle that's longer than 20 feet shall be stored in a lot, shall be screened from view. Then also, 1 recreational vehicle may be inhabited as a temporary accessory residence to a single-family detached dwelling for a maximum period of 7 days. Such use shall occur only once in a calendar year. That's pretty standard language, especially when looking at our floodplain ordinance, similar requirements. You have to have, there has to be an actual vehicle, so that means we'd be looking for license, tags, title, registration, actual operable condition, inflated tires. It has to be roadworthy. Satellite antennas, this is a very challenging one. Our ability to regulate satellite antennas in terms of design standards are really controlled by historic design guidelines through HARB. We have to allow for the installation. The proposal we have now, and this is something there's a reason why it's being suggested. So it's a maximum of 2 satellite antennas per unit shall be permitted in a residential district. This is something that I suggested. The request had initially been a maximum of 1 satellite antenna per unit. The reason staff is suggesting 2, that allows for someone then to have television and internet services on separate providers. in thinking about this since drafting, I mean, it would probably makes sense for the maximum to go back to 1. That way we avoid a situation where there's going to be clutter on our historic properties. We are starting to see it with the challenges of paying for cable internet versus satellite internet, and the operability of that becoming a better product year over year. We're going to probably see satellite antennas start to pop up again. So it's something, staff would make the recommendation at this time to go back to 1 satellite antenna per unit.
Would you do a few more to go to 419?
Okay. Okay.
Screens and buffers.
Screens and buffers. So this is in effect one of our landscape ordinances, so to speak. This provides specific vegetation requirements for certain uses in districts. It's so that those higher density districts aren't incompatible with residential districts or residential uses that are happening. The screening requirements are pretty standard. We're going to be looking for our dumpsters to have enclosures, making sure that plantings in the landscape component of a subdivision land development plan are meeting these requirements. And then also ensuring that there's going to be some feasible maintenance plan. This is something, when looking at our landscaping ordinance, we've identified some challenges that could probably be better addressed in a standalone ordinance. So it'd be something that will probably be coming back for discussion at some point in the future. But as it relates to buffering, it's pretty standard. The side and rear yard requirements, this is just establishing that you have to have at least 1 side and 1 rear yard. There is it gets into it's corner lot to a certain extent with that provision. Streetscape design, this is, I'll make sure this is the right one. Yeah, okay.
Actually, can we stop on that?
Stop
This is
there.
going to be more difficult. So let's go to anything he just said. I'll begin with satellites. I support you restricting that to 1. Chad, you have the history here. I remember Councilmember Noggle making this a big effort several years ago. And is this in keeping with whatever was decided back then related to satellites?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
So I support the 1. Anyone disagree? Okay, so yeah, do make that change. What else in what John just shared?
I'll just ask, at one point I remember we were discussing like this idea of 5G antennas that companies are wanting to put out being a potential thing that we should think about creating ordinance to control. Would you say from your opinion that this would include the thinking about that potentiality?
So we've developed 2 different land uses that one encompasses those facilities that are in the public right-of-way and then those that are on private property, with the ones that are on private property limited, I believe, only to the industrial zone. I can pull that up really slowly. But yeah, so that's how we've addressed the wireless. There's wireless telecommunications facilities that are smaller now. Yeah, so wireless communications facilities, small wireless communications outside public right-of-way, and that's permitted in the INS, HC, industrial, and with special exception in the CI district. But otherwise, they're allowed everywhere in the public right-of-way.
Others?
Why is there a specific cutout for healthcare in the screens and buffers? It seems like yeah.
Yeah. I believe the idea, I can only imagine that they were thinking about the use of ambulances to have an increased buffer standard. That's the only, like, you gotta have flashing lights and you gotta have sirens. But to my knowledge, that one's a direct port from the current ordinance. I can check real quick on that.
And I guess, I mean, could it be their generators maybe, or?
Yeah, I mean, they have, with what we just recently approved, an oxygen tank farm. So, I mean, they have some pretty industrial things happening at that location, which, I mean, it could make sense to have an increased buffer as a result.
Any other questions or suggested changes? Okay, then let's do the streetscape with Old Town, number 418.
This gets into your downtown building design, block design. Really, when it comes to these standards, they get into ensuring that the building type is going to be more urbanized, it's going to have a different feel than a suburban, even a suburban style commercial operation. It's something unique. In doing that, the design standards are what would be considered new urbanism. Main Street America trying to have traditional design elements for a downtown corridor. Parking is designed to be not in the front of the building. You're supposed to be having it away and screened. The actual design of the parking, we get into that. There's screening requirements, integrated requirements for the actual design. And when looking at these types of developments, if we have this opportunity for a site development, land development plan to come before the Planning Commission, these would be elements that you would be reviewing in addition to the general district standards. Looking at building types, looking specifically, these are kind of aspirational design standards, but really trying to have vertical uses as opposed to single stories, trying to have larger buildings on these sites. I mean, when you look at our downtowns in America historically, the best building stock was designed as taxpayers so that the property could be able to afford its rents. So it is, to a certain extent, trying to preserve that type of built environment that is not necessarily feasible today for new construction. Building heights, this is where we have that minimum of 2-story height. Design standards, looking at the building heights again. Also, in looking at the historic design guidelines. Lighting gets a little bit challenging. Most of the designs we have for lighting, we can benefit from having a standalone ordinance once again. So we include these provisions, but most of our more challenging, or I guess more practical lighting elements are provided by the borough in the public right-of-way, especially in those streetscape enhancement districts, which we'll get to in a little bit. But the design standards themselves, just making sure that we're designing lights that aren't interfering with the public or creating blinding effects. Table 4.04, the required decorative streetlight installation locations. This is another placeholder type of scenario. Generally, with the subdivision and land development plan, that would be the instance where you are designing these public improvements. We put them into the zoning ordinance to allow for these to still be maintained. When we have new development coming in, then we would have these areas would be reviewed for those decorative street lights. It would be in a situation where there's a change of use. That's when we would begin looking at the improvements. But as I noted earlier, this is a stopgap until we get to modifying the subdivision land development ordinance to better expand on these this built environment. Let's see, the gateway standard, making sure that we have entrances that are promoting the town's character. Street trees, once again, we're trying to have vertical elements throughout this area. Let's see, signage, it does have some general provisions related to signage. We have a standalone sign ordinance. All of these provisions are included in that ordinance.
I think you missed fences, walls, and hedges.
Yes. Fences, this, let's see, there is the 30-inch high wall fence or hedge shall be used at the build-to line to screen existing off-street parking. Wall design, it has to meet the same characteristics as the built environment. Sidewalks and crosswalks. This is ensuring that we are meeting our ADA requirements at 5-foot widths, making sure that crosswalks, adequate widths. We would also review this and approve it with regards to our sidewalk ordinance. Streets and alleys, this is where it starts bleeding over into the subdivision land development areas. Those design standards are really not really doing much, with the exception of alleyways having that 16-foot width. Curb cuts, excessively wide curb cuts shall be narrowed to a minimum width of 24 feet. So you can't have an excessively large driveway. You're going to be looking at 2-car width.
Okay. So this section is somewhat pulled from the old streetscape overlay.
Yes.
And inserted here as a supplemental. Does anyone have any comment on the decision to do that, or any of the items that John just laid out here?
I would just take staff's recommendation on whether to keep it or any changes.
Was there any significant community response to this?
No.
Any further comment on this one?
I think there was maybe one comment about gateways, and I was wondering how, I was curious about the, where was it about the gateways? It mentioned wanting to reduce sign clutter, and I feel like there are some entries into the borough that have lots of signs. How does the borough decide what to keep, what goes there, what considered clutter, when to start removing clutter? And then when it says piers should be provided at gateway, as gateway monuments, what kind of piers? Do we have any piers currently? And we going to be putting in piers? What are they?
I'll begin with the idea is to have some sort of placemaking occurring at our entrances. They're pretty well defined. The borough would evaluate our public right-of-way where we can do those improvements. If there's opportunities for private improvements, we would look to probably work as the borough, working with the property owner. That's pretty much all I have on that one, to be honest, because it's not something that this ordinance really regulates very well. It's just, it's kind of making reference we need to be doing something with our entrances.
The piers?
So I can maybe add a little bit of flavor to that. So I am not aware of any gateways that the borough currently has. I think that's more of a goal for the future. There are gateways around that we can use as example. For instance, the ones to the National Cemetery. There are some gateways there where they have those flanking piers. The idea was to have those at most of the state road entrances to the borough, kind of signify that you're entering the borough. It's a traffic calming device. We are currently evaluating the potential of adding one of those with the Gateway Connectivity Project. So we do have a landscape architect going to be presenting that to the Borough Council in November. So that's kind of the goal. Now, the reality of this becoming a private requirement for a private development is not real likely. That's kind of more of a public, like John said, it's going to be more of a borough initiative to add these gateways than the reality of a private developer doing that. But that doesn't mean that it couldn't happen. It's just more likely that it's going to be a borough initiative. As far as the signage that you talked about with your first question, that's a good question. I don't know how we would start governing and saying what signs have to be eliminated as part of a gateway. That would be a tough one. I would have to go back to the sign ordinance, right?
All right, any more on the streetscape? Okay, John, 4 more. Bring it home.
Okay, so next up we have transit bus stops. These are both sheltered and non-sheltered facilities. The idea is to have a generalized standard, but also maintaining the requirements from PennDOT and the ADA. The locations and signs, they would all have to we'd be working, the borough would be working with Rapid Transit to be able to provide, I guess, these types of facilities. If there's an opportunity, though, where we have a subdivision land development plan come in for a larger development, this could be something to proffer and work with the developer on the specific requirements of the design of those facilities. Moving on to 2 or more principal buildings or structures on one lot. This is a carryover from the existing ordinance. This one kind of makes me grind my teeth a little bit. But it allows for more than one building or structure to have, so you have multiple principal uses occurring on one parcel. Generally, that's something that's frowned upon in zoning, but it seems to work in Gettysburg. It also allows for, it is a way to allow for additional housing opportunities, so it's something I'm not necessarily loath to want to get rid of immediately, because it does provide some additional density. Visual obstructions, you cannot have things that are in the line of sight, you cannot interfere with pedestrian movement or traffic. The clear sight triangle, that's a method, so if you're turning, be able to see vehicles that are coming at you. If there's a big tree or a sign in the way you can't see them, well, that's a problem. It's something that we can actually utilize our police powers to remove those impediments. And that's the side triangle design. It's pretty easy. You have an intersection, you go back 10 feet, up 4 feet, that's where a person's eye would generally be expected if they're driving a vehicle. You can then utilize that distance to establish, based on speed of the road, where that point would be required to be able to establish the clear sight triangle. Yards, that's just establishing what a yard is. It's space provided to satisfy the yard area and parking requirements. However, you cannot use the yard area or parking requirements for another building or structure. So 1 yard to one use, or one parcel, so to speak.
Okay, any comments on those last 4 or questions? Okay, we've now reached the second public comment, and let me explain where we are as we take a breath here. First, we have covered the R2 and the 22 supplemental regulations. Thank you, those of you who are still here. So please, in a minute, come up and speak and tell us what we did wrong or what you think we should consider on those 2 items. Also know that we have a few items under number 3, but given the time, I'm going to suggest that, and we'll see how the public comment goes, but that we revisit those items at the November meeting. And here are the items that I have so far. The definition of family is something that was at a prior meeting and brought up in public comment at this meeting. Secondly, a return to the R1, uses related to multifamily conversion, group home, and sober living. That was the second thing that could be revisited about R1. And then 3, the revitalization district. We received comments from a few residents. We had 2 members not at the last meeting. I would like to revisit the revitalization. So those are my suggestions for prior meetings, districts, and standards and definitions that could be revisited, but most likely not today. Please feel free to comment on R2, supplemental regulations, or the things that I just explained, or other items on the agenda at this moment. And I think Ms. Sibberly's been waiting to come up for a while now.
I guess I'll start from the most recent thing you talked about. You just described yards, which is an area between the permitted structures and the property lines. That disagrees with your build-to line, which says that the yard is between the curb and the build-to line. For instance, on High Street, your build-to line is 10 feet from the curb. That's your front yard, the way this is defined. When you go to put up a fence or a swimming pool, your front yard is anything behind that build-to line. No matter where your house is, that's defined as your front yard. The way the current ordinance is and the way this is written, you could have a 6-foot-tall fence across the front of your yard at the build-to line. Yards need to be consistent. And I said this a couple months ago at a presentation and did a drawing that showed the area between your house and the build-to line is really not your front yard according to the way these are written. So if you say you can't have a swimming pool in your front yard on High Street, your front yard is the sidewalk. It has to be fixed. So, that said, and I think the landscape ordinance that you've just been going through, it's a lot redundant, and I think at the time it was kind of overkill, so I haven't looked at the specifics of that in a while, but I think there's part of that that could be left out. Now, at the previous meeting, where a couple of you weren't here, I had submitted some comments about the fact that on Carlisle Street, this zoning ordinance proposes to take out the residential office strip there. And that is a zone that gives some opportunities to the properties along there. There is a funeral home. There's also an academic building for the college. I think it includes the motel on the end. And there's several large buildings owned by the college that are student housing, but there are like at least 10 students in there. So I didn't see any reason why that needed to be removed and turned into R2. Because some of those private properties, you could have a little cafe in there or something, which would be a benefit to the area. If that goes through, you won't have any commercial uses allowed north of Water Street in the borough. And I think that's wrong. And I think it decreases the possibilities for that strip. It's always been zoned the same as Baltimore Street. And it's very similar. It's got houses built in the 1800s and beyond. I didn't appreciate the assertion that my comment about group homes was discriminatory in nature. I was talking about occupancy levels. One requires a minimum of 4 and a maximum of 10, and the other uses are limited to a family of 4. Also, the analysis of Carlisle Street is incorrect. The college has academic building on there, and they own many of the larger structures, which could be used for a variety of things. So, and also, you were talking about the church, and rightfully so. The financial interests of the parties when it comes to the motel on Carlisle Street were considered. Like, what if the college wanted to sell it someday? But what if, I mean, you've got to be equitable in your decision-making. So, anyway, I know it's an arduous process, but I did some detailed comments last time on the various uses proposed in the R2. Those could happen anywhere in the borough in an R2 district. And I also commented on the Carlisle Street change in zoning. So I'd appreciate it. I spent a lot of time on these comments, and appreciate it if someone would pay attention sometimes.
Thank you, Ms. Zipperly, and thank you for your comments at every meeting, and we will return to some of these items at the November meeting. What other comments are there? She was first, and then you.
Sharon Michaels, 120 York Street, and I have one comment and then a question. My comment is that I noticed in the definition of the sober living and halfway houses that it specifically talks about them being non-licensed. And the Department of Drug and Alcohol Programs for York Adams actually is in the process of licensing those facilities, and I think it would be useful not only for the borough's purposes, but also for the clients, because they're going to get better service in a licensed facility if you would make those licensed instead of unlicensed. The question I have is the areas that are being actually rezoned, the neighborhood commercial areas, when are those going to be discussed? Because that's a significant change for the people and businesses in those areas. And I'm afraid we're running out of time. And then same thing with the one about the industrial. I just want to make sure that time is given equally to all the different areas of the borough.
Just to answer that, since it's a direct question, the fourth item is process timeline, so we're about to revisit that with the director or the planning office director in a second.
Well, I just was thinking about this R2.
Could you just name and address for the minutes?
Suzanne Castile, live in the borough of Gettysburg. I was thinking about this R2 and rezoning. I can't quite understand why Middle Street, West Middle Street, would be rezoned R2. It's a state highway. It's one of the main arteries through town, and there's all these businesses, as well as the Foursquare Church, but all these other businesses, like the shopping center, you know, faces on West Middle Street. Not faces, but it, you know, it's on West Middle, and there's so many businesses there, and it's a state highway. I mean, it's 116 in Gettysburg, it's West Middle Street, but I'm trying to understand why that would be changed to R2 when it's such a thoroughfare and a state highway and you know, I mean, it would affect a lot of people, and I don't live on that street. I don't have any financial interest on that street, but I just think if people ever wanted to sell their properties, if they ever wanted to, it just seems to me that making a street like that residential, I don't know. Is there any particular reason for doing that there's all these businesses that are along there already. What about the existing businesses?
Okay. When we do the process timeline, we're going to address this topic of the map. So if you could just hold, we will talk about the map and how we're going to discuss, to conclude the discussion, how we're going to conclude the discussion on the map.
Oh, is that...
It would be a little longer probably to get into the details right now of rezoning certain parts of the borough. We have discussed this at a few meetings, but we'll explain in a few seconds about the map.
Oh, so it's going to be another night that we're talking about the map?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, sorry. It's just that some people have brought up commentary about that R2.
Thank you. Other comments?
Hi, Shelley Nouse, 28 Chambersburg Street. I just wanted to, since it was discussed tonight about the special uses for R1 and R2, to just kind of a reminder that part of this was to protect housing stock for single-family homes, because I think there's a large percentage of the borough, over 50%, that is maybe rental right now. Am I correct on that, John?
It is substantial.
So that is important, and we have the opportunity for some of those special uses in other districts, so maybe it would be a good thing if they could be excluded from R1 and R2.
Thank you. Okay, John, here we go. Thank you for the public who commented and who has stayed with us. The suggestion that I would like to make is that we do three things at the next meeting. The first thing is that we do, and I think punch list is not the correct phrase, but I couldn't come up with a better one. There are ongoing topics that we have not directly put to rest or directly resolved. We have been resolving things, but not everything. And I do sympathize with some of the comments that were made about items that were brought up at previous meetings or emails that were shared with us that have not been adequately resolved. So I think the first thing would be that on our agenda that we do that, the final punch list of items that are unfinished or unresolved. The second item that we do at our next meeting is to do a full review, not like in the meeting, but everyone come with your full review of inconsistencies, typos. There was one that was brought up tonight. I know you've caught others, Sarah, that you might have to raise, and the public has shared a few. If there are things that do not make sense, if there's a period in the wrong place, if there's a word that's misused, that the Planning Commission brings that to the floor. And then finally, we do the map. There's a map question that came, well, there are at least 2 or 3 map questions that came up today. The map is where we started this whole process at the very first meeting in June. And it would probably be good to end on the map, since it really affects property owners where they are. And now we're at a place, we've reviewed all 5 parts. We've had discussion about all 5 parts, but there are unfinished things, and the map could be revisited. So that's my proposal to this group and to our very generous planning director, that we do those 3 things at the November meeting. Okay. And also knowing, group, that we're most likely to have land development plans again. We've been able to direct all this attention on this whole meetings on the rezoning because we have not had land development plans, but likely we will soon.
They're coming.
They're coming, yes. So we have to be prudent in the way we spend our time, and we have lost some people today in the room because of probably the length of the meeting, but I appreciate everyone's attention. So this is my request. That means that we are going to move beyond item 3, knowing that there are some items that are there that we will revisit. And what about item 4? Anything additional to the process timeline than what I just laid out for the November meeting?
We could, on the agenda, we'll just have a blank space for anything else that would be outstanding. Yeah, and we would probably anticipate at the November meeting having, hopefully, a subdivision land development plan for Gettysburg Station.
Okay.
We have
Yeah,
an
that's-
additional one that we're also teeing up for a townhome development, but I don't think they're going to be at a place where they can submit an application.
Yeah. So the meeting will be partly spent on those items I just mentioned, the punch list of unfinished items, we'll see where that goes, the full review of inconsistencies or typos in the map, and then part on a potential land development plan that's coming forward. Any objections to that from the Planning Commission? All right, here's some announcements. The Planning Commission is scheduled to meet on November 18th, 2024 at 7 p.m. Where is that meeting, John?
That will be at the municipal building in the council chamber.
Okay, so we're back to our usual space to complete a subdivision and land development plan application for Gettysburg Station or 108 North Stratton Street. So look forward to that. Are there additional comments from the Planning Commission?
Just a quick thank you to all of you. I mean, you thanked us, but really, we have a vested interest by being a part of this process, but you're just here because you're passionate about your community, and I really appreciate that. Thank you.
And I want to just add, on the topic of comments that we have received by email or through voicemail or on the website, John has been keeping track of those. They come in different formats, and I am a little sometimes concerned that we're missing something, and that's not because anyone is not doing their job, it's just it comes in different formats, different times of day, in different ways. And before we vote, I'm certain that these members are going to, take seriously everything that we've received and make the best decision. That's my thinking about this group. Is there a final public comment?
Will there be a red line? Plenty of time to review it.
Okay, so that was Sharon Monahan. You want to just identify yourself so it's... Okay. The last item with the track changes. I'm going to start calling them track changes, given my misspeak last meeting. The last time we saw that was in August. Where do you think we would be with this next?
Staff is working on a draft. I'd hope to have it out prior to this meeting. We will work to have it out within the next week or week and a half.
Thank you. Thanks. And that means on the website?
On the website, yeah, and we would also have an updated map indicating some of the changes that we've previously discussed with the Planning Commission for some properties and identifying those that are requested by the applicants or requested by property owners.
Is there any other final public comment? And I hope I answered the questions that were raised by some individuals in the last round. But if I didn't, this is another chance for public comment. Okay, seeing none, is there a motion to adjourn our meeting?
I'll move to adjourn.
Is there a second?
I second.
Okay, so Marty moved and Jenny seconded. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Okay, the meeting is adjourned by a 5